There's a quiet kind of pain that doesn't scream, it doesn't bleed, it doesn't break things, it just withdraws. You see it in the corner of a classroom, in the hush of a dinner table, in the child who learned too early that silence keeps the peace. That being unseen was safer than being misunderstood. They sit there, small and still, tracing invisible patterns on the table with their fingers, watching conversations unfold like distant waves they'll never reach. When they do speak, it's soft, careful, as if words might shatter the air around them. They learned young that love is not guaranteed attention, that affection is not always freely given, and so they built a world inside their heads, one where they were held, heard, and safe. The ignored child, not abused, not shouted at, just overlooked. It sounds harmless, almost gentle, doesn't it? But neglect, even in its quietest forms, rewires the mind in ways that echo for decades. It teaches the child to become an observer of their own life, to seek connection while fearing exposure, to long for presence while preparing for absence. Psychologists call it emotional neglect, a term that sounds clinical, almost sterile, yet behind it hides one of the most common and invisible forms of childhood wounding. Unlike trauma that explodes, this kind corrodes. It seeps slowly. John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, once wrote that a child's sense of self is born in the gaze of the caregiver. When that gaze is absent, not abusive, not hostile, just absent, the child's inner mirror cracks. They begin to ask quietly, if no one looks at me, do I really exist? And that question follows them into classrooms, into friendships, into love. They grow into adults who apologize for taking up space, who mistake indifference for peace, who flinch when someone finally listens, because attention feels too heavy, too foreign, too close. In the stillness of their upbringing, they mastered invisibility. But invisibility, once learned, is hard to unlearn. It becomes an identity, a defense, a way of surviving a world that once refused to notice. They were never truly invisible. They were simply waiting to be seen. You can almost feel the ache of that sentence. It lingers in those who were praised for being so mature, so independent, so easy. But independence, for many ignored children, is not freedom. It's armor. They learned that needing others was a liability, that their emotions were inconvenient, that their voice could disrupt the fragile peace of a distracted home. So they built silence into themselves, brick by brick, until the silence became their home. And yet, even in silence, the longing remained, that faint, unspoken wish. Notice me, not because I've achieved, not because I'm useful, but because I exist. This is where their story begins, not in the moment they were left alone, but in the moment they realized no one was coming. Because neglect is not just the absence of care, it's the absence of recognition, the slow erasure of selfhood in the eyes of those meant to reflect it back. And so, the child disappears. Not from the world, but within it, smiling when needed, performing when praised, fading when unseen. But deep beneath that performance, something waits. A pulse, a whisper, a faint defiance that says, I am still here. They were never truly invisible. They were simply waiting to be seen. And in that waiting, they began to shape the quiet resilience that would one day save them, even if they didn't yet know it. This is the psychology of the ignored child. Not a tragedy, but a quiet story of adaptation, of learning to survive without warmth, of creating meaning in the absence of being noticed. In their silence lies both the wound and the wisdom, and it's time we finally look. But for the ignored child, the mirror never quite responds. They cry and no one comes. They share and no one listens. Over time, the brain adapts. The prefrontal cortex learns suppression. The limbic system learns vigilance. The nervous system learns to predict disappointment before it arrives. Neuroscientists at the NIMH describe this as emotional undernourishment. The brain wires itself around absence. It starts prioritizing self-containment over connection. Emotional regulation becomes self-taught, unmirrored. This is why so many adults who grew up emotionally neglected describe their feelings as distant, muted, or foggy. They don't lack emotion, they lack the language and safety to feel it, and yet their bodies remember. The ignored child develops what psychologists call a neglect schema, a deeply embedded belief that their emotional needs are unimportant or burdensome. It's not a thought they can consciously articulate. It's a background hum that influences everything: who they love, how they cope, when they speak. This schema gives birth to two common survival patterns. The first is hyperindependence, the belief that self-reliance is safety. These individuals become high achievers, caretakers, the ones who never ask for help. Their competence becomes their camouflage. They've learned that to need is to risk rejection. The second is rejection sensitivity, a hypervigilant awareness to any sign of disinterest or distance. A late reply, a sigh, a shift in tone. Each one feels like confirmation of what they always suspected. I am too much or not enough. In adult relationships, these patterns collide. They crave intimacy, but feel unworthy of it. They pull closer, then retreat. They test love through silence, wondering if anyone will notice their absence. And the tragedy is, this dance doesn't come from manipulation. It comes from longing, from a brain shaped by unpredictability. Carl Jung once wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." The ignored child carries not just their own unmet needs, but often the emotional fatigue of caretakers too overwhelmed or distracted to be present. Many of these parents weren't cruel. They were just absent, emotionally preoccupied, depressed, perfectionistic, or numb from their own unresolved wounds. And so the child learned to disappear, to adapt around the parent's void. This adaptation, though, comes at a cost. They learn to earn love through behavior, not through being. They become the peacemakers, the listeners, the good kids. But deep down, a quiet resentment forms, not toward their parents, but toward themselves, for never being enough to be seen. Viktor Frankl, the existential psychiatrist, said that when meaning collapses, suffering becomes unbearable. For the ignored child, meaning itself is distorted. Because love was conditional or inconsistent, they spend adulthood trying to decode how to deserve it. And that decoding never ends. It becomes a lifelong thesis. What do I need to do for someone to finally see me? But here's the truth. No achievement, no relationship, no external validation can undo a childhood where presence was absent. Because the wound was never about doing. It was about being unseen while being. And yet, this realization is not hopeless. It is, in fact, the beginning of awareness. When the ignored child becomes the self-aware adult, they start noticing the pattern, the silence after the text, the discomfort in asking for help, the inability to trust that care can exist without effort. They begin to recognize that the past isn't repeating itself to punish them, but to invite them to see what was unseen before. They were never truly invisible. They were simply waiting to be seen. And slowly, this truth begins to shift something deep inside, that the love they've been chasing was never about someone else's eyes. It was about learning to meet their own. This is the turning point, when psychology meets consciousness, when the schema is no longer a destiny, but a pattern that can be rewritten. Because even neglect, when understood, becomes a form of knowledge. The ignored child learns what presence means precisely because they lived without it. And in that understanding, the possibility of healing begins to flicker. Small, fragile, but real. The ignored child grows up. They learn to navigate the world with practiced ease, polite smiles, thoughtful words, quiet grace. To everyone else, they seem composed, independent, calm. But inside, a subtle emptiness hums like static. They've built a life that looks whole, a career, relationships, friendships that feel warm but somehow distant. They laugh, they listen, they care deeply, but something never quite lands. There's always a faint sense that they're performing in a play whose script they never agreed to. It's not that they don't love. They do, sometimes too much, but they love through hyper-attunement. They watch for micro-expressions, tone shifts, pauses. They anticipate others' needs before their own emotions can even surface. Because in their nervous system, love equals vigilance. Psychologists describe this as adaptive empathy, the ability to sense others' emotional states at the cost of losing your own. It's not empathy as connection, but empathy as survival. For the ignored child, attunement to others was the only way to stay safe. To matter, they had to matter to someone else. And yet, no matter how much they give, the old feeling returns. The quiet ache, the disconnection, the suspicion that no one really sees them. Because even now, in adulthood, they replay the childhood pattern, choosing partners who are emotionally unavailable, friends who drift, jobs where their efforts go unnoticed. It's not intentional. It's familiarity. The nervous system finds safety in the familiar, even when the familiar hurts. Nietzsche once wrote, "The snake which cannot cast its skin has to die." As well, the minds which are prevented from changing their opinions, they cease to be mind. For the ignored child, adulthood is that shedding, painful, necessary, terrifying, because the first step toward healing is admitting how much they've been shaped by absence. Absence leaves a mark. You feel it when you hesitate to text first, when a compliment makes you anxious, when silence in conversation feels like rejection instead of rest. These are the echoes of the neglected nervous system, small, persistent reminders that your worth was once unconfirmed. Many adults who grew up emotionally neglected struggle with alexithymia, the inability to name or describe their emotions. Ask them what they feel, and they'll pause, search, then deflect, because their childhood taught them to intellectualize, not to feel, to analyze the emotion, not to inhabit it. They might even feel guilty for feeling lonely, because on paper, nothing is wrong. They survived, they succeeded, they learned to adapt. So why does something still feel missing? That something is recognition, the internal knowing that your emotions matter simply because they exist. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote that the greatest despair is to be unconscious of being in despair. Emotional neglect operates precisely like that. Invisible despair, a quiet erosion of selfhood, so subtle that even the sufferer doubts it's real. And so they minimize. They say it wasn't that bad. They compare themselves to others who suffered more obvious pain. But comparison invalidates healing. Because wounds don't compete, they coexist. The ignored child doesn't need pity. They need permission to name what was missing, to feel what was unfelt, to believe that their pain is real even if it was silent. They were never truly invisible. They were simply waiting to be seen. In adulthood, that waiting becomes a quest. They seek spaces that mirror them back. Therapy, art, writing, community. They begin to find language for the silence. And in speaking, they begin to reclaim what neglect stole, their right to exist, unperformed. But healing isn't linear. It's cyclical. They'll find moments of connection and still feel the pull of isolation. They'll practice vulnerability and still fear being too much. The nervous system doesn't forget overnight, but each small act of truth, each time they allow themselves to be seen without earning it, rewrites the old code, and gradually the pattern weakens. The ignored child, now an adult, begins to realize something profound. The love they've been searching for externally can also be given internally, not as a substitute but as a foundation. They begin to see that being noticed is not a prerequisite for being real, because they were never truly invisible. They were simply waiting to see themselves. Healing from being ignored is not about rewriting the past. It's about teaching the nervous system that safety can exist in the present. For years, the ignored child's brain learned a single lesson. Attention is unpredictable. Every interaction became data for survival. Over time, this shaped their neural pathways, particularly in the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, areas tied to threat detection and emotional regulation. The brain became wired not for trust, but for anticipation. Healing then begins with neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire itself through repeated experiences of safety. When someone listens without judgment, when boundaries are respected, when love arrives consistently, new neural patterns form. What was once vigilance begins to soften into trust. Therapists working with emotional neglect often use reparenting techniques. These involve creating the kind of internal dialogue the child never received. You're allowed to feel. You don't have to earn love. You are safe now. At first, the words feel foreign, even absurd, but slowly, the body begins to believe them. Self-compassion isn't indulgence. It's re-education. The adult self becomes both caretaker and witness, providing what the parent could not. Philosophically, this echoes Viktor Frankl's belief that meaning is not found in avoiding pain, but in responding to it. Healing doesn't mean erasing what happened. It means transforming the wound into wisdom. The neglected child becomes the adult who finally asks, "What does love mean when no one taught me?" And through that question, they begin to find their own definition. Connection too becomes a practice. Eye contact, slower speech, letting others in, even when it feels unsafe. The body, once conditioned for withdrawal, starts to rediscover the warmth of presence. The healing journey is rarely dramatic. It's quiet, subtle, often invisible, just like the wound itself. It's the choice to stay when you want to run, to speak when silence feels easier, to trust that your voice has weight, even when it trembles. Because healing is not about being noticed by others first, it's about noticing yourself. They were never truly invisible. They were simply waiting to be seen. And at last, they are, not through someone else's eyes, but through their own. At its core, being ignored is not merely a psychological wound, it's an existential one. It disrupts the ancient question every human unconsciously asks, do I matter? When a child's emotional world goes unseen, they don't just lose comfort, they lose orientation. The self becomes fragmented, one part yearning to be known, the other protecting itself from being forgotten again. Kierkegaard might have called this the sickness unto death, the despair of not being oneself. But what does it mean to be oneself after years of invisibility? For the ignored child grown into adulthood, selfhood is often a reconstruction project. They've spent decades adapting to others' needs, becoming mirrors instead of faces. Now they must learn to stand before their own reflection, unfiltered, unperformed. Philosophy meets psychology here. Nietzsche wrote that one must give birth to a dancing star from chaos. The neglected child knows chaos intimately, the chaos of uncertainty, of emotional hunger, of being unseen. But within that same chaos lies creative potential. The absence that once hollowed them now becomes the space where meaning can emerge. In therapy rooms, in quiet journaling, in moments of solitude, they begin to reclaim authorship over their narrative. They stop asking, who failed to see me, and start asking, who am I beyond what was unseen? It's a shift from reaction to creation, from echo to voice. This is not denial of pain, it's integration. Carl Jung believed that wholeness comes not from perfection, but from owning one's shadow. The ignored child carries a shadow of silence, but also a deep well of perception. Having once been unseen, they often see others with extraordinary clarity. Their empathy, once survival, becomes wisdom. Meaning arises not despite neglect, but through it. The emptiness becomes a mirror, showing that being seen was never the ultimate goal. Being known by oneself is, and when that realization dawns, something profound happens. The old question, do I matter, begins to fade. It transforms into something quieter, steadier. I exist, and that is enough. They were never truly invisible. They were simply waiting to be seen. And now finally, the seeing begins from within. Healing does not always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like softness, like learning to pause before apologizing for existing, like speaking a feeling aloud without shrinking from it, like realizing you no longer need to earn the air you breathe. The ignored child, now the healing adult, begins to understand that love was never about performance. It was about presence. The very presence they were once denied, they now learn to offer themselves. In quiet moments, they start to see how far they've come. There was a time when silence felt like suffocation. Now silence can feel like peace. There was a time when being unseen felt like death. Now solitude feels like self-communion. This is the paradox of healing. What once wounded you becomes your doorway to understanding. The absence that once defined you teaches you to value presence in its purest form. From a neuroscientific lens, this transformation isn't abstract, it's physical. New neural pathways grow with every act of self-recognition, every moment of safe connection, every gentle boundary upheld. The body begins to unlearn hypervigilance and relearn trust. The heart rate steadies, the breath deepens. The body says, I'm no longer waiting for the next absence. And within that safety, identity starts to bloom. The adult who once lived as a ghost becomes tangible. They rediscover laughter that isn't cautious, tears that aren't shameful, intimacy that doesn't demand constant vigilance. They learn that vulnerability is not exposure, it's expansion. In the words of Viktor Frankl, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. The ignored child could not change their parents' silence. But now, as an adult, they can change the meaning of that silence. They can turn it from void into vessel, a container for empathy, creativity, and understanding. And that's where healing transforms into legacy. The once ignored become the ones who notice, the ones who listen deeply, love patiently, and create spaces of safety for others who still live unseen. In learning to see themselves, they become mirrors for the world. Because being ignored was never the end of their story. It was the beginning of their awareness. A long journey back to belonging. They were never truly invisible. They were simply waiting to be seen. And now, they are. Fully, quietly, radiantly. Seen not because someone looked at them, but because they finally looked back.